3 days after burying my father, I returned to the isolated farmhouse outside Grand Island, Nebraska. The drive from the cemetery had been quiet, nothing but flat land and endless sky keeping me company. Each mile closer to the house felt like a step backward in time. I sat at the kitchen table, running my fingers over the scratched wooden surface where Dad had drilled the 5 rules into my head countless times throughout my childhood. The familiar weight of tradition pressed down on me, heavier now that he was gone. The rules had seemed ridiculous when I was younger. Arbitrary restrictions that kept our family isolated and strange. As an adult, they'd become the source of countless arguments between us. Never look when something taps on your window at night. Don't go outside when the sky turns red, no matter what you hear. Don't leave food outside after sunset. Stay inside when you hear noises from the cornfields. Always be home before dark. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee, as if Dad had just stepped out. His ancient percolator sat on the stove, a thin layer of dust already forming on its surface. A stack of papers lay scattered across the table where the lawyer had left them an hour ago. Property deeds, tax forms, and the keys to a house I wasn't sure I wanted. I picked up the deed, the yellowed paper crackling between my fingers. The Harrison family had owned this land for generations. But what did that mean to me now? I had a life waiting in Omaha. A job offer, an apartment lease ready to sign. Normal things, reasonable things. Things that didn't involve rules about tapping windows or red skies. "It's your birthright, David," Dad had whispered from his hospital bed, his voice already growing faint. "You have to stay. You have to follow the rules. They're watching. They're always watching." Those were his last coherent words before the morphine took him under. When he died the next morning, I was left with nothing but questions and a property I'd spent years trying to escape. Outside, the sun had slipped below the horizon, painting the kitchen in deep shadows. I hadn't bothered to turn on the lights yet, letting darkness creep in like an old, unwelcome friend. The house creaked and settled around me, 100 years of wood and memories adjusting to the cooling night air. I reached for my phone, scrolling through real estate listings in the area. The farmhouse would sell easily enough. Good land was always in demand, even with the outdated structures. I could be done with this place by the end of the month if I pushed the paperwork through quickly. Yet something held me back. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the look in Dad's eyes when he'd made me promise. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't quite name that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever I thought about breaking that promise. The soft tap against glass pulled me from my thoughts. Tap, tap, tap. It came from upstairs, from my old bedroom window, the same tapping I'd heard the night after the funeral when I'd stayed here alone, trying to sort through Dad's belongings. I set the deed down and listened. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. 3 quick raps followed by silence, then 3 more. Dad's first rule echoed in my head. Never look when something taps on your window at night. As a kid, I'd asked him why. "Because they want you to look," he'd said, his face deadly serious. "They want you to see them, and once you do, they can see you too. Really see you." I dismissed it as superstition, the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone with his thoughts. But sitting there in the dark kitchen, with that persistent tapping breaking the silence, I felt the first flicker of doubt. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood up. This was ridiculous. There was a logical explanation. A tree branch, a bird, maybe even kids from down the road playing pranks. I'd spent too long letting Dad's fears control my life. It was time to face whatever was out there. I made my way upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. The farmhouse had never had proper insulation, and already the autumn chill was seeping through the walls. My childhood bedroom door stood ajar, a rectangle of deeper darkness against the shadowed hallway. The tapping grew louder as I approached, more urgent, almost desperate. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, 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 tap. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My old bedroom looked frozen in time. Posters of bands I'd outgrown still taped to the walls, sports trophies collecting dust on shelves. The narrow twin bed pushed against the wall beneath the window. The curtains were drawn, heavy fabric blocking whatever waited outside. My hand reached toward the edge of the curtain. One quick peek. That's all it would take to prove to myself that Dad's rules were nothing but the paranoid restrictions of a lonely old man. The tapping stopped suddenly, as if whatever was outside knew I was there, waiting. "This is stupid," I muttered to myself, fingers inches from the fabric. Then I remembered the look on Dad's face the first time he'd explained this rule to me. I'd been maybe 7 or 8, woken by tapping on my window during a thunderstorm. I'd called for him, and he'd come running, faster than I'd ever seen him move. When he found me standing at the window, about to pull back the curtain, he'd yanked me away with such force that I'd fallen to the floor. I'd never seen him so afraid. Not when Mom left. Not when the bank threatened foreclosure. Not even in the hospital when the doctors told him about the cancer. His hands had shaken as he'd knelt beside me. "Never look," he'd whispered, his voice trembling. "Promise me, David. Never look." Outside my bedroom window, something scraped against the glass. Not the soft tap of knuckles or a branch, but the sharp, grating sound of claws dragging across the surface. Slow, deliberate. My hand fell back to my side. The memory of Dad's fear suddenly more real than my skepticism. The scraping continued, moving from one edge of the window to the other. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a bird or a branch or neighborhood kids. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The supernatural threats Dad had warned me about all my life were already testing me, sensing my doubt about staying and following the rules my family had obeyed for generations. I fumbled for the light switch but stopped myself. Dad's voice seemed to whisper from every shadow in the room. "They can see you better in the light." Instead, I backed out of the bedroom, closing the door behind me. The scraping sound continued, muffled now, but still persistent. I retreated downstairs to the kitchen, where the deed and paperwork still lay scattered across the table. My hands shook as I gathered the papers into a pile. Whatever I decided about the house, about my future, it wouldn't be tonight. Tonight, I would follow the rules, just to be safe, just until morning. The tapping followed me throughout the house that night, moving from window to window as if tracking my movements. I stayed away from the curtains, away from the glass, remembering my father's warnings and wondering for the first time if they might actually be true. I woke to sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. I must have fallen asleep at the table, my head resting on my arms amid the scattered paperwork. My neck ached from the awkward position, and my mouth felt dry. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. Grief does strange things to people, and between the funeral, the will reading, and the weight of decisions about the farm, my mind had plenty of reasons to play tricks on me. I stood and stretched, working out the kinks in my back. The kitchen looked normal in the morning light, just an old farmhouse kitchen with dated appliances and worn linoleum floors. Nothing supernatural about any of it. Coffee first. I filled the percolator and set it on the stove, trying to ignore how much the simple act reminded me of Dad. While it brewed, I decided to check the window upstairs. In daylight, there would be a reasonable explanation for the sounds I'd heard. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking familiarly underfoot. The house felt different in daylight, less threatening, more like the home I'd grown up in. My old bedroom door stood open just as I'd left it the night before. The curtains were still drawn. I approached the window, hesitating only briefly before pulling the heavy fabric aside. What I saw made my stomach drop. Deep gouges marked the wooden frame around the glass, fresh enough that small splinters still stuck out from the edges. 4 parallel lines cut into the wood, each about a 1/4 inch deep. not the work of a branch or animal I recognized. I pushed the window open and leaned out, looking down at the ground below. The flower bed that ran along this side of the house showed clear impressions in the mud, prints that looked almost human, but weren't quite right. They had 5 digits like a hand, but each finger was elongated, and they spread wider than any human hand could stretch. Whatever had made them had been standing directly below my window last night. I pulled back inside, shutting the window firmly and drawing the curtains closed again. The coffee maker downstairs hissed and sputtered, signaling it was done, but I stood frozen by the window for several more seconds. Dad's rules didn't seem quite so ridiculous anymore. After a cup of coffee and a shower, I knew I needed answers, not the kind I'd find in this house where every corner now felt like it might hide something watching me. I needed to talk to someone who might know what was happening. I drove into town, following the familiar route into Grand Island. The farmlands gave way to scattered houses, then proper neighborhoods, and finally the small downtown area. Not much had changed since my last visit. The same storefronts, the same courthouse square, the same public library where I'd spent countless hours as a kid. Sarah Miller had been the town librarian for as long as I could remember. Dad used to drop me off at the library when he had errands to run in town, and Sarah would help me find books about whatever had caught my interest that week. She and Dad had always been friendly, exchanging quiet conversations I couldn't quite hear whenever he picked me up. The library was housed in a century-old brick building with tall windows and wooden shelves that reached toward high ceilings. The smell hit me as soon as I walked in. Old paper, furniture polish, and that indefinable library scent that hadn't changed since my childhood. Sarah sat at the main desk, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. Reading glasses perched on her nose as she cataloged books. She looked up when the door closed behind me, and I saw recognition flash across her face. "David Harrison," she said, setting aside her work. "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I said, approaching the desk. "I was hoping to talk with you, if you have a minute." Sarah studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Let me get Janet to cover the desk." She disappeared into a back office, returning moments later. "We can talk in the local history room. No one uses it much on weekday mornings." I followed her through the main reading area to a small room tucked in the back corner of the library. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, filled with leather-bound county records, old maps, and photograph albums. A large table occupied the center of the room, currently empty except for a reading lamp. Sarah closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "You're staying at the farm?" she asked. "For now," I said. "I'm still figuring things out." She nodded, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Your father worried about what would happen to the place after he was gone. Did he talk to you about it?" "He talked to me about a lot of things over the years." Sarah moved to one of the cabinets, unlocking it with a small key she pulled from her pocket. Things most people would have dismissed. My heart beat faster. "The rules," I said. "He talked to you about the rules." Sarah glanced back at me, her expression serious. "He did, and I helped him research them, their origins, their purpose." She pulled out a large book bound in faded green cloth. "Your father wasn't crazy, David. He wasn't making things up." She set the book on the table and opened it, revealing brittle yellowed pages of newsprint carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. The Grand Island Independent, dated October 17th, 1893. "Your great-grandfather Alexander Harrison came to Nebraska in 1890, shortly after homesteading opened this area," Sarah explained, turning pages gently. "He bought land that local farmers had abandoned. Land, they said, was cursed." She stopped at a page with a headline that read, "Another disappearance near North Settlement." I leaned closer, reading the faded print. Frederick Walton, 42, became the 3rd resident to vanish without explanation this month. His wife reports that he went to check on livestock after hearing strange sounds from the barn. When he failed to return, neighbors organized a search party that found only his lantern, still lit at the edge of his cornfield. There were 12 disappearances that year, Sarah said quietly, all on farms within 5 miles of your family's land. The next year, only 3. The year after that, none. What changed? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Sarah turned more pages, stopping at another article dated 1896. Your great-grandfather published this letter in the paper. The headline read, "Local farmer offers advice on rural safety." The letter detailed 5 precautions that all county residents should observe, the same 5 rules my father had drilled into me throughout my childhood. He presented them as common-sense safety measures, Sarah explained, but the families who followed them survived, those who didn't. She pulled out another book, this one filled with county death records. Names were highlighted throughout, dozens of them, spanning decades. Cause of death? Unknown. Missing, presumed dead. Accident, suicide. So many deaths, all within the same small area. Your father came to me when he inherited the farm, Sarah continued. He found journals his father had kept, documenting strange occurrences around the property. He wanted to understand what he was dealing with. And did he? Did you? Sarah closed the books carefully. We found patterns. We found evidence. But understanding? She shook her head. Some things resist understanding, David. They simply are. She returned to the cabinet and brought back a manila folder, placing it on the table in front of me. Your father asked me to give you this if something happened to him. I opened the folder to find photocopies of old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and pages from what appeared to be a journal written in Polish with English translations in the margins. There used to be 8 families following these rules, Sarah said. Over time, they moved away or died out. Some abandoned the rules and she trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. And now? I asked. Now it's just you, she said simply. You're the last one, David. I stared at the documents, trying to process what this meant. Why didn't he ever explain any of this to me? He just kept repeating the rules without context. He tried to protect you from the burden of knowing, Sarah said. He hoped you might never need to understand why the rules existed, just that following them would keep you safe. But now I need to understand. Sarah nodded. Take those with you. Study them. Your father spent years piecing this together. I gathered the documents, my hands not entirely steady. Thank you, Sarah. Be careful, David, she said as I turned to leave. Whatever's out there, it's been contained by your family's vigilance for generations. If you leave, what happens if I leave? Her expression grew troubled. Your father believed it would spread, that whatever's bound to your land would seek new territory, new people. I drove back to the farm with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, my mind racing. The scientific part of me, the part that had studied engineering in college and worked with concrete facts, wanted to dismiss all of this as superstition and coincidence. But the scratches on my window frame and those strange prints in the mud weren't so easily explained away. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon as I pulled up to the farmhouse. The weather forecast had mentioned possible severe thunderstorms, and the darkening sky confirmed it. I carried the folder inside and spent the afternoon reading through my father's research, each page revealing a history I'd never suspected. My great-grandfather Alexander had brought knowledge with him from the old country, knowledge about entities that existed at the edges of our world, looking for ways in. The land he'd purchased so cheaply had already been compromised, the barrier between worlds thin and permeable. His rules weren't superstitions. They were practical measures to prevent further incursions. Outside, the wind picked up as evening approached. Tree branches scraped against the side of the house, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall. I turned on lamps throughout the downstairs, trying to keep the shadows at bay. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and went out completely. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the battery showed 1% before going black. The power outages were common enough out here. The rural electric grid was the first to go down in storms, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I remembered the emergency lanterns in the mudroom and the generator in the shed behind the house. Dad had always been prepared for power outages, keeping the generator maintained and fuel cans filled. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the kitchen. In that split-second snapshot, I saw the rain coming down in sheets. I needed to get the generator running before the food in the refrigerator spoiled and the house grew too cold. I searched drawers for the flashlight we kept in the kitchen, but couldn't find it. The battery-powered lantern in the mudroom would have to do. I made my way there by memory and feel, stubbing my toe painfully on a chair along the way. The lantern wasn't on its hook. Dad must have moved it, or perhaps I had misremembered where it was kept. Either way, I was left with a choice. Wait out the blackout in darkness or make a dash to the generator shed. The rain had eased slightly when I peered out the back door. The shed was only 30 yards from the house, a quick sprint across the yard. I'd make it there and back in 2 minutes. Tops. I stepped outside, immediately regretting not grabbing a jacket as the cold rain soaked through my shirt. The storm clouds had turned the early evening prematurely dark, but I could still make out the shed's outline. I jogged across the muddy yard, focused on my destination. I was halfway to the shed when I noticed the quality of light had changed. The gray gloom of the storm had shifted, taking on a reddish tinge. I stopped, looking up at the sky. Despite the storm clouds, the entire sky had turned a deep, unnatural red. Not the red of sunset or sunrise, but something darker, more sinister, like the color of fresh blood. Dad's second rule echoed in my head: don't go outside when the sky turns red, no matter what you hear. I stood frozen in the yard, rain streaming down my face as I stared at the crimson sky. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the soft patter of rain. Then I felt it, the weight of eyes on me. I wasn't alone in the yard. I turned toward the cornfield that bordered the eastern edge of the property. The cornstalks stood motionless in the strange red light, forming a wall of vegetation that seemed to absorb the darkness between the rows. Something moved there, a shadow shifting, separating itself from the greater darkness. A figure emerged from between the rows of corn. Tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, with limbs too long and too thin to be human. In the red light, its skin glowed like hot metal, and its eyes burned with the same crimson hue, never blinking as they fixed on me. It took a step forward, then another, moving with unnatural speed despite its jerky, awkward gait. Those glowing eyes never left mine as it closed the distance between us. I broke from my paralysis and ran toward the house, my father's warning screaming in my mind. The red man was coming, just as my father had always feared, and I had broken the rule that kept it at bay. My boots slipped in the mud as I sprinted across the yard, the house seeming impossibly far away. Behind me, I could feel rather than hear the creature's approach, a cold pressure pushing against my back, growing stronger with each second. I reached the porch steps, taking them 2 at a time. My hand closed around the doorknob as I felt something brush against my shirt from behind. I slammed the front door behind me, throwing my whole body against it as something heavy crashed into the other side. The impact rattled the entire frame, shaking dust from the ceiling. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the deadbolt, my wet fingers slipping twice before the lock clicked into place. I backed away from the door, unable to take my eyes off it. The wooden panels creaked and strained as if under immense pressure. Then suddenly the pressure vanished. I moved to the living room window, carefully staying to the side of the curtain, rather than standing directly in front of it. Peering through a small gap, I saw it, the red man, circling the house with slow, deliberate steps. Its movements were jerky yet fluid, like a stop-motion animation come to life. In the crimson light that still bathed the yard, its skin glowed like heated metal, and those eyes, God, those eyes, burned with the same unnatural red, never blinking as they swept across the house. The rain continued to fall, but the creature moved through it untouched, not a single drop seeming to land on its elongated form. "What are you?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. As if it heard me, the creature stopped and turned its head toward my window. I ducked back, heart hammering as I pressed myself against the wall. I counted to 60 before risking another glance. The red man had moved to another part of the yard, continuing its circuit around the house. Its footsteps made no sound that I could hear through the storm, but I felt its presence like a cold weight pressing against the walls, a physical pressure that made my ears pop and my skin crawl. I moved from window to window, tracking the creature as it paced. My father's words kept replaying in my mind. Don't go outside when the sky turns red, no matter what you hear. I hadn't just gone outside. I'd locked eyes with the very thing the rule was meant to protect me from. For almost an hour, I watched the red man circle the house, never varying its pace, never showing any sign of giving up. Then gradually the crimson light began to fade. The sky darkened to a deep purple, then back to the natural gray of the storm. As the last traces of red disappeared from the horizon, the creature paused at the edge of the cornfield. It turned toward the house one last time, those burning eyes finding me through walls and curtains. I felt its gaze like a physical touch, cold and calculating. Then it stepped backward into the corn and vanished, the stalks barely moving as it disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, moving from room to room with a baseball bat I'd found in the closet. I knew it would be useless against whatever that thing was, but the weight of it in my hands provided some small comfort. The storm eventually passed, leaving the house in silence except for the occasional drip of water from the gutters. Morning came with pale sunlight and birdsong, as if the previous night had been nothing but a nightmare. I might have convinced myself of that if not for my mud-caked clothes and the deep gouges in the front door, 4 parallel lines cut into the wood matching the marks on my bedroom window frame. I made coffee with shaking hands, downing 2 cups before I felt steady enough to venture outside. The yard was a mess of puddles and debris from the storm, but otherwise appeared normal. No strange footprints, no lingering sense of wrongness, until I walked down the driveway. My father's mailbox, a sturdy wooden post with a metal box that had weathered decades of Nebraska storms, had been torn completely from the ground. I found it 20 feet away, twisted into an impossible shape. The metal had been folded and bent like origami, forming a crude star pattern that no human hands could have managed without tools. The wood of the post had been snapped clean through, not splintered, but broken with surgical precision. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The metal was cold to the touch despite the morning sun. Inside the twisted remains of the box was a single piece of paper folded neatly. I pulled it out and unfolded it to find a child's drawing of a house with stick figures inside. One figure was colored completely black, standing taller than the others. Across the top, written in red crayon, were words in a language I didn't recognize, jagged symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. I dropped the paper, watching as it dissolved into the mud at my feet, leaving no trace. Back in the house, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand. I needed to talk to someone about what was happening, but who would believe me? Sarah Miller might, given our conversation yesterday, but she only knew what my father had told her. I needed someone who had grown up with the same stories, the same rules. I called my cousin James. We'd been close as kids, spending summers together on the farm, building forts in the barn and wading in the creek at the back of the property. We'd both grown up hearing the rules, but James had always been more skeptical than I was. He'd moved to Denver after college and rarely came back to Nebraska. He answered on the 4th ring. David? Hey man, I was going to call you. I heard about Uncle Robert. I'm really sorry. Thanks, I said, the normalcy of his voice already making me feel more grounded. How's Denver? Good. Busy with work. I wanted to come to the funeral, but we're in the middle of a big project and I couldn't get away. It's fine. Listen, I'm at Dad's place, the farm. There was a pause. You staying there? For now. James, do you remember the rules Dad used to have? The ones your parents talked about too? Another pause, longer this time. Uncle Robert's weird safety rules? Yeah, I remember. Don't look at the windows at night, don't go out when the sky's red, that kind of thing. Did your parents ever explain why, where those rules came from? James laughed, but it sounded forced. My dad said it was just old family folklore, superstitions from the old country. He never took it as seriously as Uncle Robert did. And you never saw anything strange when you visited? Like what? His tone had shifted, grown more cautious. I thought about how to explain the red man, the twisted mailbox, the scratches on my window. It all sounded insane, even to me. Just things that couldn't be explained, noises, shadows, anything out of the ordinary. David, are you okay? You sound stressed. I'm fine. Just trying to make sense of some things Dad left behind. James sighed. Look, Uncle Robert was intense about those rules. My dad said he got more paranoid after your mom left. The isolation probably didn't help. He wasn't paranoid, I said, more sharply than I intended. There was a reason for the rules. Okay, sure. Whatever helps you process. But my advice, sell the place. You never wanted to be a farmer anyway. Get out of there. Come to Denver for a while. I've got a spare room. It's not that simple. It is that simple. List the property, pack up what you want to keep, and move on. Those rules, whatever Dad and Uncle Robert believed, it's not your problem anymore. I looked at the gouges in the front door, visible from where I sat. What if it is my problem? What if Dad was right? Right about what? Monsters in the cornfield? James's voice had taken on the patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being ridiculous. We're not kids anymore, David. There's no boogeyman waiting to get you if you break the rules. I wanted to believe him, wanted it to be that simple. But the image of the red man's glowing eyes wouldn't leave my mind. Maybe you're right, I said finally, not wanting to argue. I know I'm right. Call a realtor tomorrow. Let the next owner worry about the haunted cornfield. We talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation had lost its purpose. James had made his position clear. The rules were folklore, my father had been paranoid, and I should move on. Maybe that's what I wanted to hear all along, permission to walk away. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day cleaning up from the storm. I nailed a piece of plywood over the scratches on the front door and gathered fallen branches from the yard. The work kept my hands busy while my mind churned over everything that had happened. By evening, exhaustion had set in, physical and mental. I heated a can of soup for dinner and ate it standing at the counter, staring out at the darkening sky. No trace of red tonight, just the normal gradient of orange to purple to deep blue. As I washed my bowl in the sink, a thought occurred to me. What if James was right? What if the rules were just superstitions? I'd already broken 2 of them and survived. Maybe the red man was just a hallucination brought on by stress and grief. Maybe the scratches and the twisted mailbox had other explanations. There was one way to find out. My father had always been strict about sound in the house after dark. No music, no TV, and definitely no whistling or singing. Sound carries at night, he'd say. Carries to places and things you don't want hearing you. I dried my hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. Then, deliberately, I began to whistle. A simple melody my father used to hum when he worked. an old folk tune I never knew the name of. The sound seemed strange in the quiet house, hanging in the air longer than it should have. I continued the melody, watching the darkness outside the kitchen window, half expecting to see glowing red eyes peering back at me. Nothing happened at first, just the sound of my whistling and the tick of the old clock on the wall. Then I noticed the temperature change. It wasn't dramatic, just a gradual cooling that raised goosebumps on my arms. I looked at the thermostat on the wall. The reading had dropped 5 degrees in the span of minutes. I kept whistling, moving from the kitchen into the living room. That's when I saw the first shadow. It moved in my peripheral vision, a darkness deeper than the natural shadows of the room. When I turned to look directly at it, it vanished. But as soon as I looked away, I could sense it moving again, detaching itself from the corner where the ceiling met the wall. Another shadow shifted by the bookcase, and another near the front door. They weren't shaped like anything I recognized, not human or animal, but abstract, flowing forms that seemed to absorb what little light was in the room. The temperature continued to drop. I could see my breath now, puffing white in the increasingly cold air. Still whistling, I watched as the shadows grew bolder, reaching toward me with tendrils of darkness that moved with purpose. I stopped whistling mid-note, suddenly afraid of what I was inviting into the house. The shadows paused, hanging suspended in the air for a long moment. Then, instead of retreating, they began to spread. Not rushing, but slowly expanding outward from the corners and edges of the room, claiming more territory. I backed up until my legs hit the coffee table. The shadows followed, staying just outside my direct line of sight, visible only in glimpses from the corner of my eye. Waiting. I had broken another rule, and unlike the red man who had vanished with the crimson sky, these shadows showed no sign of leaving. They had been invited in, and now they were making themselves at home. The shadows never left. I spent that entire night moving from room to room, trying to find some space where they weren't watching me. But wherever I went, they followed, floating just at the edge of my vision, retreating when I turned to look directly at them, only to reappear the moment I looked away. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off on the couch, cold tendrils would brush against my face or tug at my clothes, jolting me back to wakefulness. The shadows seemed to enjoy this game, testing how close they could get before I noticed. By morning, as gray light filtered through the windows, I hoped they would vanish like the red man had when the crimson sky faded. They didn't. Instead, they changed, becoming more substantial, more defined. What had been formless patches of darkness now had shape and dimension. Some looked almost human-like, with suggestions of heads and limbs, but wrong somehow, proportions stretched and twisted, movements jerky and unnatural. I made coffee with shaking hands, nearly dropping the pot when a shadow darted past me, close enough that I felt the cold air it displaced. This wasn't just my imagination or sleep-deprived hallucinations. The shadows were real, growing stronger, and I had invited them in by breaking another of my father's rules. I didn't mean to, I said aloud, not sure if they could understand me. I wasn't trying to call you. A shadow near the refrigerator twisted in response, stretching upward until it nearly touched the ceiling. It hung there for a moment, its form vaguely reminiscent of a person, with arms raised in a grotesque parody of surprise. Then it collapsed back into itself, sliding along the wall toward me. I grabbed my coffee and retreated to the living room, where sunlight streamed through the windows. The shadows seemed less substantial in the bright light, retreating to the corners and the spaces behind furniture. Not gone, but weaker. That gave me an idea. I moved through the house, opening every curtain and blind, letting in as much natural light as possible. The shadows pulled back from the sunbeams but remained visible in the darker areas, under tables, behind the couch, in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. They weren't leaving, just biding their time until nightfall. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, enough to search for information about shadow creatures and how to get rid of them. I typed, "How to remove shadow entities from house," into the search bar. The spinning circle appeared as the phone tried to load results, but after 30 seconds, the connection failed. I tried again with different keywords: shadow beings folklore, exorcising shadows from home, getting rid of supernatural shadows. Each time, the connection dropped the moment the search went through. Frustrated, I tried searching for something innocuous: weather Grand Island, Nebraska. The results loaded instantly, showing sunny skies predicted for the day with a chance of rain tomorrow. The internet worked fine unless I searched for anything related to my current supernatural problem. That couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, the shadows were interfering with my connection whenever I tried to research them. I turned to my father's research folder from Sarah Miller instead. If anyone knew how to deal with these shadows, it would be my ancestors who had been handling the farm's strange phenomena for generations. I spread the papers across the kitchen table, scanning through the photocopied journal entries and newspaper clippings for any mention of shadows or darkness. Most of the documents focused on the disappearances and the red sky phenomenon, but a few pages from my great-grandfather's journal mentioned the watchers in the dark places and those who come when called. According to his writings, making unnecessary noise after sunset, especially music or whistling, was like ringing a dinner bell for the shadow folk. Great-grandfather Alexander wrote that the shadows weren't immediately dangerous, not like some of the other entities, but they watched and waited for opportunities. They grew stronger with time and attention. The more you acknowledged them, the more solid they became, until eventually they could do more than just watch. What they could do exactly, he didn't specify, which was far from reassuring. I needed help, but who could I call? Sarah might have more information, but it was Sunday, and the library would be closed. James had made it clear he thought the whole thing was nonsense. I considered calling a local priest, but what would I say? "Hello, I accidentally invited shadow creatures into my house by whistling, and now they won't leave." My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since the soup last night. I closed the folder and made myself a sandwich, trying to ignore the shadow that stretched across the kitchen ceiling, its edges rippling as if moved by an unfelt breeze. I needed groceries and supplies if I was going to stay here and figure this out. The general store in town would be open until 5, even on Sunday. I grabbed my keys, relieved to have a reason to leave the house for a while. Maybe the shadows wouldn't, or couldn't, follow me beyond the property. When I stepped outside, the bright sunshine felt like a physical relief after the oppressive presence of the shadows. I looked back at the house from the driveway, half expecting to see dark shapes pressed against the windows watching me leave. The windows showed only reflections of clouds and blue sky. The drive to town was uneventful, the familiar landscape of cornfields and scattered farmhouses oddly comforting in their normality. I tried to pretend things were normal too, just a regular Sunday trip to pick up groceries, not a desperate attempt to escape shadow creatures haunting my family home. The Grand Island General Store hadn't changed much since I was a kid. The same bell jingled when I pushed open the door, and the same wood floors creaked under my feet. Mr. Pearson, who had to be pushing 80 by now, still stood behind the counter. He looked up when I entered, recognition slowly dawning on his weathered face. "David Harrison, isn't it? Robert's boy. Heard about your father. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Pearson," I said, grabbing a shopping basket. "Just need to pick up a few things." I walked the aisles, grabbing staples: bread, milk, eggs, coffee, and some frozen dinners. Then I had a thought. In some of the old folklore, salt was supposed to ward off evil spirits. Worth a try. I added several containers of salt to my basket. I also grabbed candles, matches, and batteries for the emergency lanterns, practical supplies for power outages, but also potentially useful against the shadows if they didn't like light. At the register, Mr. Pearson raised an eyebrow at the amount of salt. Planning on doing a lot of cooking, son? Just stocking up, I said with a smile I didn't feel. As he rang up my purchases, he paused, looking at me more carefully. You staying out at the old place then? For now. He nodded slowly. Your daddy was a good man, kept to himself, but always fair in his dealings. Always followed the old ways, too. Something in his tone caught my attention. The old ways? You know. He glanced around though we were alone in the store. The rules, the precautions. Your family always understood the importance of tradition. My heart beat faster. Did you know my father well? Well enough. Saw him in here twice a month like clockwork, always buying the same things. He pointed to the salt in my basket. Including that. Smart to stock up. Mr. Pearson, do you know anything about shadows? Ones that seem to move on their own? The old man's face became carefully blank. Can't say that I do. But if I were dealing with unwanted guests, I might try sage. Good for cleansing a space. He reached under the counter and pulled out a bundle of dried sage. On the house, your father was a good customer. I took the sage, surprised. Thank you. Just be careful out there, son, and remember the rules. They exist for a reason. The drive back to the farm seemed shorter than the drive into town. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed the sky was beginning to darken, not with the unnatural red of the previous night, but with the ordinary approach of evening. I'd spent longer in town than I'd realized. I gathered my grocery bags and headed up to the porch. The front door was closed just as I'd left it, but something felt off. I hesitated, then set down most of the bags to free up a hand for my keys. Inside, the shadows were waiting. They seemed excited, moving faster than before, swirling around the ceiling and walls like leaves caught in a wind. Had they grown while I was gone? Some of them looked larger, their shapes more defined. One near the staircase almost looked like it had a face, a blank oval where features should be. I carried the groceries to the kitchen, trying to ignore the shadow that followed, stretching along the wall beside me. As I set the bags on the counter, I realized I'd left one on the porch, the bag with the frozen items. I went back to get it, but when I opened the front door, the porch was empty. The bag was gone. I stepped outside, looking around in confusion. Had someone taken it? Then I spotted it at the bottom of the steps. The bag had fallen over, its contents spilled across the walkway. I climbed down to gather everything, stuffing frozen vegetables and a package of chicken back into the bag. As I picked up a plastic container of leftover pasta I'd bought from the deli section, I heard the phone ringing inside the house. Hurrying to answer it, I left the container sitting on the edge of the porch, forgotten. It was James, calling to check on me. I didn't tell him about the shadows or the red man. What was the point? He'd just tell me I was sleep-deprived or hallucinating from stress. We talked about normal things, his job, a girl he'd started dating, whether I'd called a realtor yet. The conversation helped me feel grounded again, connected to the real world outside this farm. After we hung up, I unpacked the rest of the groceries, not realizing one item was missing until hours later. By then, the sun had set completely, and the house had grown dark except for the lamps I'd turned on in every room. The shadows had retreated somewhat from the light, but they hadn't gone. They gathered in the darkest corners, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore them as I heated up a frozen dinner in the microwave and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, afraid to sit with my back to any dark space. It was while rinsing my plate that I remembered the pasta container. I'd left it outside on the porch. Food left outside after sunset. I'd broken another rule. I rushed to the front door and flung it open. The porch was empty, the container was gone. My heart sank as I closed and locked the door. 3 rules broken now. I'd looked when something tapped at my window. I'd gone outside when the sky turned red, and now I'd left food outside after dark. Only 2 rules remained unbroken, and based on recent events, The consequences were escalating with each mistake. The house felt colder than before, the shadows more restless. I walked from room to room, turning on every light, even opening closets to eliminate hiding places. In my father's bedroom, I found his emergency supplies in a trunk at the foot of the bed. Extra flashlights, batteries, candles, and several bundles of dried sage like the one Mr. Pearson had given me. I took everything to the living room and sat on the couch, surrounded by light. The clock on the wall showed 11:30. In half an hour, it would be a new day. I just had to make it through the night without breaking any more rules. A scraping sound from the back of the house made me freeze. It came again. A slow, deliberate scratching against wood. Something was at the back door. I took a flashlight and one of the sage bundles and made my way to the kitchen. The shadows seemed to follow, growing denser around me, almost as if they were herding me toward the sound. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove. The scratching was louder here, coming from the back door that led to the yard. Something moved outside the small window in the door, a tall, thin silhouette visible as a darker shape against the night. I approached carefully, shining the flashlight toward the window. Two hollow eyes reflected the light back at me, not glowing red like the creature from the cornfield, but empty, like holes punched through a mask. The face they belonged to was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over sharp bones. As I watched, it pressed closer to the glass, long fingers with too many joints scratching at the wood around the frame. The hungry had come, drawn by the food I'd left out, just as my father had warned. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It wasn't trying to get at the food anymore. That was long gone. Now it wanted in. It wanted me. The scratching intensified, and I heard wood splinter as its fingers dug into the door frame. The lock wouldn't hold for long against that strength. The shadows in the kitchen grew more agitated, swirling around me, brushing against my skin with cold touches. They were excited, eager. Whatever was outside, they wanted it to get in. I remembered the sage in my hand and Mr. Pearson's words. Good for cleansing a space. My lighter was still in my pocket from when I'd lit the stove earlier. With shaking hands, I flicked it and held the flame to the sage bundle. It caught, smoldering rather than blazing, releasing a thick, aromatic smoke. The effect was immediate. The shadows retreated from the smoke, pulling back to the edges of the room with movements that suggested pain. I waved the smoking sage in wide arcs, driving them further away. Outside, the creature at the door let out a high, thin sound, part shriek, part hiss, as the smoke drifted toward the window. It pulled back from the glass, those hollow eyes fixed on me with unmistakable hatred. I moved closer to the door, holding the sage bundle out in front of me. The creature hissed again, backing away into the darkness of the yard. I could still see its silhouette, standing at the edge of the light that spilled from the house, watching. The shadows in the kitchen had retreated to the corners, but they hadn't disappeared. They seemed to pulse with anger or frustration, their edges sharper than before. The sage was keeping them at bay, but I didn't have enough to cleanse the entire house, and it would eventually burn out. I was holding the line, but barely. I'd broken 3 of my father's 5 rules, and now I was dealing with multiple supernatural threats simultaneously. The shadows inside, the hungry creature outside, and who knew what else waiting for me to make another mistake. Each error had made my situation worse. The shadows were growing stronger, and now they seemed to be working with the thing outside, trying to help it get to me. They weren't just passive observers anymore. They were active participants in whatever was happening. I stood in the kitchen with the smoking sage bundle, watching the creature outside and the shadows within, understanding at last what my father had tried to protect me from all these years. The rules weren't superstition or paranoia. They were survival. I spent the next few hours moving through the house with the smoking sage bundle, watching as the shadows retreated from the aromatic smoke. They didn't leave completely. just pulled back to the edges of rooms, huddling in corners and under furniture, waiting for the sage to burn out. Outside, the creature with hollow eyes had withdrawn from the back door, but remained in the yard, a thin silhouette pacing at the border between light and darkness. My back ached from tension, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. The digital clock on the microwave showed 3:17 in the morning when the last of the sage finally crumbled to ash in my hand. I had 2 more bundles from my father's supplies, but I decided to save them. I needed to ration what I had until I could find more. I settled on the living room couch with all the lights on, planning to rest for just a moment. Despite my best efforts, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The crash jolted me awake. I sat up, disoriented, my heart pounding. The living room was darker than it should have been. Several of the lamps had gone out. The clock on the wall showed 10 after 9. I'd slept through sunrise, but the house felt as dark and oppressive as it had during the night. Another crash came from outside, so powerful it made the windows rattle. This wasn't thunder or farm equipment. It sounded like something massive being thrown or toppled. The noise had come from the direction of the cornfields. I moved to the window, careful to stay to the side as I peered out. The morning sky was overcast, casting everything in a gray light that did little to dispel the shadows still lurking in the corners of the room. In the distance, the cornfield swayed unnaturally, not with the rhythm of wind, but in violent, localized bursts as if something large was moving through it. Another crash, and I saw several corn stalks go flying into the air. Something was out there, something big enough to make that kind of disturbance. The 4th rule echoed in my mind. Stay inside when you hear noises from the cornfields. I had already broken 3 rules. I wasn't about to break another. As I watched, the violent movement in the corn stopped abruptly. The field went still, not even a natural breeze disturbing the stalks. Then, slowly, the corn began to part in a straight line, a path being created that led directly toward the house. I backed away from the window, my mouth dry. The shadows in the room seemed to grow more substantial, gathering around the doors and windows as if in anticipation. One detached itself from the wall beside me and brushed against my arm. The touch was like ice water against my skin, and I jerked away. The shadows had grown bolder. Yesterday they had merely observed. Now they were making contact. A sharp tapping came from upstairs, the same 3 quick raps I'd heard on my first night back at the farm. Then another set of taps from a different window, then another. Soon tapping came from every window in the house, a discordant rhythm that made my teeth clench. I tried to remember the layout of the farm from my childhood. The land extended for about 200 acres, with the house situated near the center. The cornfields stretched to the east and south, with pasture to the north and a small wooded area to the west. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, too far to hear me if I called for help. Something scratched at the back door, the same sound I'd heard last night, but louder, more insistent. I moved to the kitchen and saw the hollow-eyed creature was back, its skeletal face pressed against the window. But it wasn't alone this time. 2 more faces crowded beside it, all with the same empty eyes and needle teeth, their 2 long fingers scraping at the wood. The hungry had returned, and they'd brought friends. I reached for the salt I'd bought yesterday and poured a thick line across the threshold of the back door, remembering vague folklore about salt keeping evil at bay. I wasn't sure if it would work, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. The creatures outside hissed when they saw what I was doing, pressing harder against the glass. The window creaked under the pressure, a small crack forming in the corner. I retreated to the living room, only to find shadows grabbing at my clothes as I passed through the doorway. They'd become solid enough to tug at my shirt and pant legs, trying to hold me in place. I swatted at them, my hands passing through cold patches that dispersed momentarily before reforming. The house itself began to shudder. as if something massive was leaning against its walls. The lights flickered, and for a moment I thought the power would go out again, leaving me in darkness with the shadows and whatever waited outside. But the lights stabilized, casting weak yellow pools that barely kept the darkness at bay. Everything was happening at once. The crashing in the cornfield, the tapping at the windows, the hungry creatures at the door, and the shadows growing bolder inside. It wasn't random. They were coordinating, working together to overwhelm me. They sensed my weakness, my doubt about the rules. I'd broken 3 of them already, showing these entities that I was vulnerable, that I didn't believe. And now they were coming for me all at once. I needed help, not the kind I could get from Sarah Miller or Cousin James, but the kind only my father or his ancestors could provide. There had to be more to the rules than just avoidance. There had to be a way to fight back. I made my way upstairs, the shadows trailing behind me like a cold wake. In my father's bedroom, I began searching through his things more thoroughly than I had before. His dresser drawers contained only clothes and personal items. The closet held old coats and boxes of tax records. Nothing that would help me. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. Dust bunnies and a pair of old slippers. Nothing else. The tapping at the windows grew more insistent, now sounding more like pounding. The house continued to shake as if in the grip of a localized earthquake. Then I noticed something about the floorboards near the head of the bed. One board seemed slightly raised compared to the others. I pressed on it, and it moved under my fingers. A loose floorboard, concealing a small space beneath. I pried it up with my fingernails, ignoring the splinters that dug into my skin. Beneath was a hollow space containing a leather-bound book and a small wooden box. I pulled them both out as another violent crash came from outside, this one close enough to make the entire house shudder. The book was my father's journal, not the research notes Sarah had given me, but a personal account filled with his neat, precise handwriting. The wooden box contained more sage bundles, a small silver knife with strange symbols etched into the blade, and several small cloth bags tied with string. I opened the journal with shaking hands, flipping through pages filled with detailed accounts of supernatural encounters dating back decades. My father had documented everything: the tapping at the windows, the red sky, the hungry creatures, the shadows. He had categorized them, noted their patterns and weaknesses. I skipped to the final entries, written just days before his death. The last page was dated 2 weeks ago. "The activity is increasing," he'd written. "More entities appearing than I've ever seen before. The barriers are weakening after all these years. I fear what will happen when I'm gone. David will face the worst of it. They'll sense his inexperience, his disbelief. They'll come all at once, testing him. God forgive me for the burden I'm leaving him. But there's no one else. The Harrison blood must continue to hold the line." He had known. Somehow my father had known this night was coming. Known that I would be tested like this. The next page contained what he called emergency procedures. Detailed instructions for dealing with various supernatural threats. For the shadows, he recommended sage smoke and specific words to be spoken while facing each corner of a room. For the hungry ones, salt lines at thresholds and a mixture of herbs to be burned near windows and doors. For the tapping, a specific sequence of knocks to be returned, not to invite them in, but to warn them away. I gathered the supplies from the box and hurried back downstairs. The shadows reached for me as I passed, now bold enough to wrap around my ankles, trying to trip me. I stumbled but kept moving. In the living room, I lit one of the sage bundles and began the ritual my father had described. Standing in the center of the room, I faced each corner in turn, waving the smoking sage and reciting words my great-grandfather had brought from Poland, words that felt strange on my tongue but somehow right, as if my blood recognized them even if my mind did not. "Z cienia do światła, z ciemności do dnia." Nie jesteś tu mile widziany. Odejdź. From shadow to light, from darkness to day. You are not welcome here. Be gone. The effect was immediate. The shadows shrank back, not just retreating to the corners, but actually diminishing in substance. They became thinner, more transparent, their edges less defined. They didn't disappear completely, but they no longer reached for me. Next, I mixed the herbs from the cloth bags according to my father's instructions: sage, rosemary, and something that smelled like cinnamon but sharper. I placed small piles near each window and door and set them alight with matches from the kitchen. Pungent smoke filled the house, making my eyes water but driving the hungry creatures back from the doors and windows. I could still see them outside, their hollow eyes reflecting the gray daylight, but they no longer pressed against the glass or scratched at the wood. The tapping continued, though, growing more violent with each passing minute. I climbed the stairs again, sage bundle in hand, and approached my old bedroom window. The curtains moved with each impact, the glass vibrating in its frame. According to my father's journal, what waited outside wasn't just trying to get my attention anymore. It was trying to break through. I stood to the side of the window and knocked on the wall beside it. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 2 quick knocks, another pause, then 4 slow knocks. The pattern my father had written down, passed through generations of Harrisons. The tapping stopped mid-sequence. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, from the other side of the curtain came a low, angry hiss. Not human, not animal, but something else entirely. The curtain bulged inward as if something had pressed against it, and I backed away, heart hammering. I repeated the knocking pattern, louder this time. The hissing grew in volume, turning into a high-pitched whine that made my ears hurt. But the tapping didn't resume. Whatever was outside the window was angry but deterred. I moved through the house, repeating the same pattern at each window where tapping occurred. Each time, the tapping stopped, replaced by hissing or whining, but it didn't return. Gradually, the house grew quieter, the constant percussion of supernatural visitors fading to silence. Outside, the violent disturbances in the cornfield had ceased. The hungry ones still lingered at the edges of the yard, visible through windows but no longer trying to force their way in. The shadows remained in the house but had retreated to the darkest corners, no longer solid enough to grab at me. I hadn't banished them, not completely, but I'd pushed them back. I'd shown them I wasn't as vulnerable as they thought. My father's journal detailed how these encounters typically went. The entities would test the boundaries, looking for weaknesses. If they found none, they would eventually retreat, conserving their energy for the next opportunity. If they found a way in, however, they would never leave. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but alert. The clock showed 11 in the morning, though it felt much later. Outside, the day remained gray and overcast, as if the sun itself was reluctant to shine on what had transpired here. The journal lay open beside me, filled with my father's lifetime of knowledge about the farm and its supernatural inhabitants. I had only scratched the surface of what he knew, what he had dealt with for decades, while I was away building my life in the city. The rules made sense now, not just as superstitions or paranoid restrictions, but as practical measures against very real threats. My father hadn't been crazy or paranoid. He'd been a guardian, holding the line against forces that would spread beyond this land if given the chance. And now that responsibility had fallen to me. Not just because I had inherited the property, but because I carried Harrison blood. According to my father's writings, that meant something to the entities. They recognized it, feared it even, when wielded with knowledge and purpose. I picked up the journal again, turning to the beginning to start reading properly. If I was going to survive here, if I was going to take up my father's watch, I needed to understand everything he knew. Outside, one of the hungry ones lifted its hollow eyes toward the window where I sat. It made no move to approach, but I felt its gaze like a physical touch. It was waiting, patient in a way only immortal things can be, waiting for me to make another mistake, to break another rule. But I wouldn't. Not anymore. I knew better now. The entities outside grew more frenzied as the day wore on, sensing that I was fighting back with knowledge they thought had died with my father. Their movements became erratic, desperate. The hungry ones paced the perimeter of the yard, occasionally testing the doors but retreating when they encountered the salt lines and herb smoke. The tapping returned sporadically but stopped whenever I responded with the correct pattern. The shadows in the house seemed diminished but not defeated, watching from their corners with what felt like calculated patience. They had all the time in the world. They just needed me to slip up once more. As evening approached, I prepared for another night of vigilance. I laid out fresh salt lines, lit new herb bundles, and kept the sage close. The journal remained in my hand, my father's knowledge now my strongest weapon. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was protecting everyone beyond this farm. The people of Grand Island, neighboring farms, even my cousin James in Denver. My father believed these entities would spread if released from the boundaries of our land. I couldn't let that happen. The weight of this responsibility settled over me like a physical burden. This was what my father had tried to prepare me for all my life. This was what he meant when he called it my birthright. Not just land or a house, but a duty passed through generations of Harrison blood. As darkness fell, I sat in my father's chair in the living room, sage burning beside me, the journal open in my lap. The first night of my inheritance had truly begun. The night stretched endlessly as I moved from room to room, following my father's handwritten instructions with meticulous care. Every hour I refreshed the salt lines at doorways where they had thinned. I burned the herb mixtures in small ceramic bowls, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling and spread through the rooms like a protective fog. The shadows retreated from it, shrinking back into the corners where they pulsed and wavered, but no longer reached for me. Outside, the hungry creatures with their hollow eyes and needle teeth continued to test the boundaries. They pressed against windows, leaving smears of something dark and oily on the glass, only to back away hissing when I approached with burning sage. Their persistence was unnerving. They moved away, but never left, circling the house with jerky, unnatural movements. The tapping continued sporadically throughout the night. Sometimes at my bedroom window, sometimes at the kitchen or living room windows. Each time I responded with the pattern my father had documented. 3 slow knocks, pause, 2 quick knocks, pause, 4 slow knocks. Each time, the tapping ceased, replaced by that high, angry whine that made my skin crawl. By 3 a.m, my eyes burned from lack of sleep and the constant smoke. My hands trembled as I lit another sage bundle. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The journal made it clear what would happen if I let my guard down, even for a moment. They will find any weakness, my father had written, any gap in the defenses, any moment of inattention. That is all they need to gain entrance. And once they are inside, truly inside, they will never leave. I kept the journal with me at all times, referring to it whenever a new sound or movement caught my attention. The pages detailed encounters spanning decades, not just my father's experiences, but those of my grandfather and great-grandfather before him. Generations of Harrisons maintaining a vigil that I had dismissed as paranoia. Around 4 a.m, something new happened. A deep, reverberating hum began somewhere beneath the house, so low I felt it more than heard it. The floorboards vibrated subtly beneath my feet. According to the journal, this was a sign of the entities growing desperate, combining their efforts to break through. I followed my father's instructions for this situation, burning a specific combination of herbs in the basement while reciting more of those strange Polish words that felt both foreign and familiar on my tongue. The humming faded gradually, and by 5 a.m, the house was quieter than it had been all night. Outside, the eastern sky lightened almost imperceptibly, the darkness shifting from black to deep blue. The hungry ones at the windows seemed to sense the approach of dawn. They backed away from the house, their hollow eyes fixed on me with what looked like hatred, before they turned and walked with their strange, stilted gait toward the cornfields. The shadows inside the house grew thinner as natural light began to filter through the windows. They didn't disappear completely. I could still see them lurking in the darkest corners, under furniture, behind doors. But they no longer seemed capable of reaching for me or blocking my path. By 6 a.m, the immediate siege had lifted. I stood at the living room window, watching the sun rise over the cornfields. The farm looked peaceful, normal. Rows of corn swaying gently in the morning breeze, dew glistening on the grass, birds beginning their morning songs. Nothing indicated the supernatural assault that had occurred throughout the night. I sank onto the couch, exhaustion making my limbs heavy. The journal lay open beside me, my father's neat handwriting filling page after page with observations, procedures, warnings. I thumbed through it, too tired to read more but unwilling to put it down. Near the middle of the book, a passage caught my eye. I worry about David. He sees these precautions as restrictions, as burdens to escape. He doesn't understand that the rules aren't just about our safety. They're about containing what lives here. If these entities ever broke free of the Harrison land, spread to other places without someone who knows how to fight them, I can't bear to think of the consequences. My father's words hit me with unexpected force. All these years I'd thought his insistence on the rules was about tradition or control or even fear. I never considered they might be about protection. Not just for us, but for everyone beyond our land. I thought about Grand Island, just 15 minutes away. About the people there, going about their normal lives, completely unaware of what existed so close to them. About Sarah Miller at the library, about old Mr. Pearson at the general store, about my cousin James in Denver who dismissed it all as superstition. What would happen to them if these entities spread beyond our farm? If the hungry ones with their needle teeth walked the streets of town, if shadows that could touch and grab filled people's homes, if the red man from the cornfield found new hunting grounds. My father's final words from his hospital bed suddenly made perfect sense. It's your birthright, David. You have to stay. You have to follow the rules. They're watching. They're always watching. He wasn't talking about tradition or family obligation in the usual sense. He was talking about duty, a sacred duty passed down through generations of Harrisons to contain these supernatural forces, to keep them bound to this land where we knew how to fight them. I must have fallen asleep on the couch because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the clock showed past 10. I sat up with a start, momentarily panicked until I saw the shadows had retreated further, now barely visible in the corners of the room. After a quick shower and a bowl of cereal, I pulled out my phone. 1 bar of signal, enough to make a call. I dialed James's number knowing what I needed to tell him. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, cousin. How's it going out there in the boonies? Called a realtor yet?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Actually, I've decided to stay." "Stay? In Nebraska? Are you serious?" His disbelief was clear, even through the spotty connection. "What about your job, your apartment, your life?" "I'll figure it out. Remote work maybe, or find something local. I can't sell the farm, James. It's complicated." "Is this about Uncle Robert? Look, I know you feel guilty about not being around more when he was alive, but..." "It's not about guilt," I interrupted. "It's about responsibility. This place, this land, it's been in our family for generations for a reason. Someone needs to be here." "To follow the rules?" James's tone turned skeptical. "Come on, David. You don't actually believe all that superstitious nonsense, do you?" I thought about what to say. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? How could I make him understand when I'd been just as dismissive only days ago? "Let's just say I've gained a new appreciation for family traditions." I said finally. "This is something I need to do." We talked a bit longer, about practical matters, about how I'd manage the transition, about him coming to visit sometime. "Though I'm not staying overnight in that creepy old house," he'd said with a laugh that suggested he wasn't entirely joking. When we hung up, I felt lighter somehow, more certain of my decision. I spent the day studying the journal more carefully, making notes of my own, and taking inventory of my father's supplies. The wooden box from under the floorboard contained more than I'd initially realized. Small vials of oils labeled in my father's handwriting, pouches of different herbs and minerals, candles made of beeswax and what looked like animal fat. According to the journal, each item had a specific purpose in defending against the various entities. The silver knife was particularly important, used not as a weapon but as a tool for cutting herbs at specific phases of the moon, for inscribing protective symbols, and in emergencies for drawing blood, Harrison blood, which apparently held power over certain entities due to our long history with them. I went through the house room by room, noting weaknesses in our defenses. Several windows had cracks in their frames where the hungry ones had scratched. The back door's lock was loose. The basement had a small window that wasn't properly sealed. I made a list of repairs needed and supplies to buy. By late afternoon, I'd been to the hardware store in town and returned with everything I needed to shore up our physical defenses. I replaced the loose lock on the back door, sealed the basement window with caulk, and reinforced the window frames with metal plating where they'd been damaged. Physical barriers wouldn't stop the supernatural entirely, but according to my father's notes, they helped, especially when combined with the proper protective substances. I also drove to a nursery 30 minutes away to buy more sage plants. I planned to grow my own supply rather than relying on what my father had stored or what Mr. Pearson might offer on the house. If I was going to continue the Harrison watch, I needed to be self-sufficient. As evening approached, I felt the tension in the house building again. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow more substantial as natural light faded. The temperature dropped slightly, though the thermostat showed no change. Subtle signs that night was coming, and with it, the return of our unwelcome visitors. I prepared myself more systematically than the night before. I laid fresh salt lines at every door and window. I placed the herb mixtures in strategic locations throughout the house, ready to be lit. I filled small dishes with water that I'd blessed according to my father's instructions, another deterrent for certain entities. I made a simple dinner of pasta and sauce, eating quickly at the kitchen counter while keeping an eye on the darkening yard outside. No movement yet, but I knew they would come. They always came. After dinner, I walked through the house one final time, checking every lock, every window, every protective measure. The routine felt familiar already, as if I'd been doing it for years instead of just a day. Perhaps some part of me remembered watching my father perform these same checks night after night throughout my childhood. In the living room, I settled into my father's old armchair, a worn leather recliner that still held the impression of his body. The journal rested on my lap, open to a page titled, "The Nature of the Barrier." According to my great-grandfather's writings, the supernatural entities were confined to our land by a combination of factors: geographical features, astronomical alignments, and most importantly, the continued presence of Harrison blood. Our family wasn't just fighting these things, our very existence was part of what kept them contained. As darkness fell completely, the first tap came at the dining room window. 3 quick raps that I now recognized as a test, a probe for weakness. I didn't need to look to know what waited outside. Instead, I replied with the correct pattern, listened for the angry hiss that followed, and then returned to my reading. The hungry ones would be back soon, circling the house, testing doors and windows. The shadows were already gathering strength, becoming more visible in the corners despite the lamps I'd turned on throughout the house. The night had begun again, and with it, my vigil. But this time was different. This time I understood what I was doing and why. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was holding the line against forces that had been contained here for generations. I was continuing a sacred duty that had been passed down through my family, a duty I had nearly abandoned out of ignorance and disbelief. The rules weren't a burden to escape. They were a responsibility to embrace. The farm wasn't a backward place to flee. It was a battleground that needed a guardian. Outside, something moved at the edge of the cornfield. A tall, thin silhouette that might have been the Red Man or one of the Hungry Ones or something else entirely. Inside, the shadows pulsed in the corners, growing bolder as night deepened. But I wasn't afraid anymore, not like before. I had knowledge now, and purpose. I settled deeper into my father's chair, the journal open on my lap, ready to continue the family's watch over the darkness that lurked in the Nebraska fields. This was my inheritance. Not just land or a house, but a duty, a calling. And for the first time since I'd returned to the farm, I felt ready to answer it.